Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for this Signatory Forum on Embracing Introversion with Lesley Tait. I'm really excited for this session. It's one that we haven't done something similar on this topic before, which might be a little bit surprising, but actually it's an area that we're leaning into more and more, particularly as we're hearing more and more companies embrace wider meanings of what it means to be inclusive in their workplace. So we're hearing a lot more companies focusing on things like neurodivergence and how people think differently, and how they can embrace neurodiversity in their workplace. And that spurred this wider interest in how are we making sure we're embracing different types of folks within our workforces and being really inclusive about that. So really delighted to be able to run this session today, and very pleased to be able to introduce the fantastic Lesley Tait, who has agreed to be our signatory speaker for today. So Lesley, I would love to invite you to please introduce yourself to the room.
Thanks, Lexie. I'm really excited to be here today, so thank you for inviting me. Hello, everyone. So I'm Lesley Tait. I'm a career and leadership coach, and I work with female introverts in tech to help them be seen and heard so they can advance their careers.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lesley, for agreeing to kind of have a chat with us about this today. You've got a lot of experience from the coalface when it comes to looking at diversity and inclusion more broadly, but with this very specific lens of how we can support better diversity and inclusion by considering introversion. So with that in mind, folks, really glad to have Lesley here. Please do use the chat function. We'll be keeping an eye on that to pick up any interesting thoughts or questions that you might have for Lesley. But let's kick into understanding a bit more about you, Lesley, if that's okay. So we would love to understand, tell me about your origin story. What has led you to become a coach focusing on this particular area, this idea of introversion?
Yeah, so prior to becoming a coach, I have spent 33 years in corporate environments. 20 of those years were working in ICT. I'm also an introvert, and I've worked my way up from very junior positions to quite senior positions. And I got to the point in my career where I thought, what am I going to do next? Because I was always moving on, and fortunate enough to get promoted frequently in my career. And I thought, what is it that I want to do? And I did actually feel there was something missing, although I did love my job at the time. I did feel like there was something missing. And what I've always loved is helping people and watching them grow and watching them develop. So I went out and searched for that piece that was missing, and I found coaching. And I made a very brave move and decided that I was going to completely pivot my career, and that I was going to retrain as a personal performance coach. And knowing what it's like as an introvert in a corporate environment, knowing what it's like to be ambitious, but to also be conflicted, and to face some bias, I guess, to be quite frank, about my personality traits. I decided that, having trained and qualified as a coach, that I was going to help other introverts advance their careers, particularly women in tech, because I think we know that there's some gender disparity there, to say the least. So that's how I ended up where I am today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing some of those different chapters that you experienced to lead you to this point. I would love to pick up on a few things, because I'm sure there are a few people on the call who will resonate with different elements of your story. You worked in IT, you worked in corporate, you've been in, I know from us talking before, you've been in sales-based environments.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
And you've been promoted really, really quickly. You've had a successful career. So with all of that in mind, and you being an introvert, what are some of those biases that you referred to when you were just speaking then, that require us to have this need for a coach to support introverts? What does that look like, those biases that you refer to?
I think the biases that personally I experienced, and some of the biases that my clients come to me saying that they experience, is that there's a real confusion over what introversion is and what introversion isn't. And, you know, you know, as you rightly pointed out, I spent 20 of my corporate years in sales, and I didn't behave like the traditional salesperson. I wasn't maybe as outgoing. I wasn't as outspoken. I was perceived as being quite shy, perceived as lacking in confidence, and that wasn't the case. But the more I was perceived as being not the expected norm of the corporate mold, the more I felt judged, and then the more I kind of second guessed myself. And so what we often find is that introverts are very conflicted in having this ambition, but actually being very sensitive to the labels that other people give them, and questioning, well, am I good enough? Am I good enough to go further? I feel I am. I know I'm an intelligent person. I know I've got more to offer, but can I? Because people are telling me and people are behaving towards me in a way that makes me doubt myself.
That's really interesting. I'd love for us to talk a bit more about that experience that you had with that sales environment. So we'll come back to that later. But you've hinted at like a really key issue here around, well, what exactly is introversion then? If it's not those things that you were describing that other people were perceiving of you, what should we understand introversion to be?
Okay, so what introversion, extroversion, it's all about where we derive our energy. So introverts get their energy from very quiet, non-stimulating environments. We like solitude, so we can contemplate and be reflective. That's where we get our energy from. Extroverts get their energy from conversation and community and that stimulated environment. So what's important to know is that introversion and extroversion is just a spectrum, and they sit at opposing ends of that spectrum. But and each of us sits somewhere along that spectrum. It's important also to know that we can move along that spectrum. Personalities can change on a situational basis. So we do move up and down that spectrum depending on the situation that we're in. And this is particularly true of an ambivert, for example. An ambivert is someone who gets their energy from both alone time and being stimulated by social situations. Also known as the outgoing introvert, if you like. So it's really about where we get our energy from. I think I kind of just went off into a different territory there, but it is really around how we derive our energy.
It's really helpful you kind of describing that it's more than a binary here that we're looking at, because there's been, you know, tons of articles about, are you an introverted extrovert, and you know, what does that then mean? It starts to confuse what we're thinking about and what we're talking about when we try to understand introversion better. So some of the terms that I've been hearing, we've got introvert and extrovert, ambivert, as you've mentioned, the introverted extrovert. Are there any others that we need to be thinking about?
So, so much information on the internet, isn't there? So, okay, so it's really important here that we separate personality types from emotions. Okay, so when we're talking about personality types, we're talking about the introvert, the extrovert, the omnivert, and the ambivert. And if we just I mean, you can break it down into various different types of those things, but you know, we'd be here a long time. But essentially, so there is those four personality types: the introvert at one end of the spectrum, the extrovert at the other, the ambivert, who, as I said, embraces both types of those personalities and balances them very well. And then you've got the omnivert, very similar to an ambivert, but an omnivert will demonstrate very extreme types of those characters. They don't balance them particularly as well as the ambivert. So you might notice an omnivert being extremely sociable and extremely reflective and withdrawn. And I guess you might see them as having kind of dual personalities. So yeah, I think if we stick to those kind of 4 types, then we're good. Yeah.
Cool. That's really, really helpful to have some understanding of that. And you mentioned this idea of we have to separate introversion and the introversion-extroversion spectrum from personality types. And I would imagine there are probably people in the workforce who will say, where is the data behind this? This is surely just another type of personality quiz type thing that isn't really based in science. So what can you tell us about the evidence base around this approach and why it's important for us to understand it?
Yeah, it is really important for us to understand it. I mean, I think the evidence comes from originally from Carl Jung, who was one of the first people to identify introverts and extroverts in a psychological context. So there's a lot of work from Jung on the internet around the psychology of introverts and extroverts, how there are differences in their brains, and this has been studied. The brain of an introvert works slightly different to the brain of an extrovert. For example, introverts have a thicker prefrontal cortex, so there's more tissue in the prefrontal cortex area of the brain. That part of the brain is very specifically related to deep thinking and decision making. So that kind of explains why introverts are more reflective, deeper thinkers, more contemplative, if you like. So there's Jung. There's also another doctor of psychology, Dr. Elaine Aron. Her work is fantastic. And she's researched this area for about 20 years, particularly in the context of highly sensitive people. So she's a very reputable source of information. And then there's also Susan Cain. So if you're an introvert and you've read her legendary book, Quiet, then you'll know that she's researched this for again, in excess of 20 years. So there's some really reliable sources of information that tell us that, yeah, this is a thing. We're not just adding another tick box to the D&I list. No, we don't want to do that, but this is a thing.
Love that, and it's fascinating. If anyone has read that research, Leslie's kindly shared some links that we'll share after the call as well to a number of research papers and to those books that she's mentioned too. So we talked to guests a little bit about what introversion is, where's the evidence base for it, what's happening in the brain. Let's talk about what introversion isn't. So where is it going wrong in terms of our understanding in the workplace?
Okay, a lot of people, including introverts, will confuse introversion with being shy, lacking in confidence, or being socially anxious, for example. And that's not the case. Introversion, extroversion, these are personality traits. Being shy, that's an emotion. They're very different things. As you pointed out earlier, you've heard the expression, the shy extrovert or the outgoing introvert. Shyness and traits, very, very different. Yes, you can have a shy introvert. You can have an introvert who's socially anxious, but the two are inextricably linked. They are not, they don't go hand in hand. So, I'm an introvert. I'm not socially anxious. I'm not particularly shy, although I may show up as quieter in different situations. So yeah, they're not shy necessarily. They don't lack confidence, and they're not.
Thank you. So you were just saying there that we need to stop thinking about introversion as a deficit-based model, where it's the idea of being an introvert means you're weaker for whatever that environment that you're in, and being an extrovert means you're stronger. So this is not an affliction. We shouldn't be thinking about it in those terms. And it's so easy for us to slip into describing it in that way. And so I guess the really big thing here is that, can you be a chatty introvert? Should we expect to see that? Like, should we expect to align our brains to the idea that actually you can have talkative introverts, and you can have introverts that aren't, like you say, shy? We need to realign our minds to that way of thinking. Is that right?
Yeah, we do. And I think, one of the reasons why I decided to to kind of specialize in this area because of what I experienced in the workplace, is that there seems to be this gold standard that extroversion is the measure. You know, that you need to be outgoing, you need to be chatty, you need to be energetic and constantly involved, and have your voice heard and be seen. And that seems to be the kind of measure in lots of organizations. And I think it's really unfortunate that introverts or quieter people, let's say, are measured against that standard. And that if you're someone who doesn't fit this mold, then there's a really good chance that you're going to be judged for being the way you are. You know, an introvert doesn't like to be in the spotlight, and they don't want to be, they don't like to talk about themselves, particularly unless they're really comfortable with you. They don't like chit chat and small talk. Quite frankly, we find it irrelevant. We'd just rather get to the point and move on. But actually, you can have great conversations with introverts because we're not antisocial. I love to have a conversation with someone, and I much rather have a one-on-one conversation that's really deep than chat at a surface level with a group of people.
Yeah, that's really helpful to understand a little bit more, I guess, about how might this manifest in the workplace. And actually, that's what I'd love to talk about now is, you know, what are the benefits and risks if you fail to understand introversion accurately in a business environment. So I would love to hear from your practice, what are some of those examples of where it goes really well, what can the business gain, and when it's going badly, what does that mean?
Yeah, so when it's going badly, well, I mentioned introverts don't like talking about themselves. And so they're the kind of people that won't overtly promote themselves. They won't overtly promote their achievement. And so there's a potential there for talent to be overlooked. There's also an assumption there that perhaps the quieter types or the introverts aren't ambitious, and that's just not true. You know, we call ourselves quietly ambitious people because we don't shout about what it is that we want. We don't actively promote our achievements and attract that attention. As I said earlier, we can get measured against that extroverted norm. And so when it comes to performance review time, and I think this is really quite critical, when it comes to performance review time, that's the measure that's often used and often leaves us getting lower performance ratings because we're not measuring up to that expected norm. There can be feelings of isolation amongst an introverted community, you know, because they don't do chit chat, because we prefer to take quiet moments of solitude rather than engage in social chatter. That can be perceived as maybe a bit antisocial or a bit stuck up, and that's just not the case. You know, I've worked with clients who have described breaking into those cliques at work really difficult because of their introverted nature. And it's actually quite heartbreaking to see, because some of those clients have really been very emotional, very tearful about this problem, this feeling they have of isolation at work. You know, we get judged a lot, and that also makes us feel isolated, and that also can really be the starting to sow the seeds of self-doubt. As I mentioned earlier, you know, I want to move on in my career, but I'm treated differently, and actually, am I capable of doing this? So that self-doubt starts to appear. And these examples, you know, these can lead to real frustration and ultimately a lack of engagement in the workplace, and then perhaps, you know, productivity might slow down, productivity might be impacted, and there's a potential there for performance issues to be mismanaged. So yeah, there's a whole host of issues as to why if it's not understood properly, that, you know, there's a lot of risks there. And burnout is another issue. You know, imagine imagine coming to work and having to fundamentally change, or feel like you've got to fundamentally change who you are as a person. That's exhausting. For an introvert who isn't given the space to retreat and recharge their energy, that's a really exhausting place to be. And lots of introverts will go home with what we call the introvert hangover, which is the headaches, the fatigue, the nausea, and the feeling that we just cannot cope with one more thing in our heads because there's so much going on already. That would wipe somebody out, leaves them totally drained and exhausted. So if you're going home to a family, you know, you've then got no energy, nothing to give your family when you get home. So yeah, burnout is a big problem for introverts, particularly in the corporate place.
It's so interesting hearing the range of scenarios you're describing there. And I was just playing through in my head, well, where are the things where I'm seeing, oh right, actually that could have been harmful for or suboptimal for an introvert. And I'm thinking about all of this time we've focused off the back of the pandemic on let's get back into the office, let's have socials. And I'm now reflecting on, well, how inclusive were they for folks who don't want to be in those kinds of environments? How does that feel for them? Does that make them feel connected to our team? Is that helping their wellness? Is it helping their sense of digital inclusion when we're now mostly working in a hybrid fashion? And I'd imagine hybrid work environments, which are really prolific in the tech industry, are probably in a way quite a good thing, but it's also put a lot of pressure on those moments when you are with other people for us to have that slightly more gregarious approach to interacting when we've got those company away days or those connection days that happen. So it's really interesting for me to reflect on that, and also the things that you've highlighted around like the productivity and the retention side of things. You're working, coaching women specifically with this introversion lens, and it's something that we are hearing at Tech Talent Charter a lot, that companies are really focused on how can they retain and progress women. And that term women is just so broad as to not really dig into the individual needs of different people and what they might need from different progression and retention programs. And when we think about the fact that replacing someone costs, what, 30% of their annual salary, I think is what the data says. If we're not really layering into what it means to support an introvert at work, there's a very real cost to that. 30% of an annual salary for a tech role is expensive. Yeah.
I mean, you know, what I don't want to do in my work is for people to feel burdened with another layer of diversity and inclusion to add to what they're already doing. But I do think it's important to raise awareness, because I am just so passionate about exploring the introverted community within corporates, because I'm convinced there's more talent there. I am convinced that just by tweaking a few things and just understanding this a bit more, there's a lot of talent. You know, there's some research that was published in HR News. It came from an employee engagement company, Qualtrics. And that research tells us that 48% of the UK workforce identify as introverts. And 55% of those introverts believe that their organisation don't value them or feel like their voices are heard. So what we're saying is a quarter of the UK workforce are not feeling valued and they're not feeling heard. And that's in spite of the fact that 61% of them feel like they've got great ideas that would benefit their organisation. So it's really, I don't want to overburden people, but I think it's really important because there is talent out there. And as you know, to the point you were making, the cost of replacing an individual is far higher than the cost of investing in some training or some coaching or some mentoring to actually retain that individual. And I've seen what it can be like when big companies lose lots of talent. You know, it massively impacts the bottom line.
those are some absolutely shocking stats that you shared, Lesley. That's so interesting. Let's talk about it then. Let's talk about this from the point of view of this talent that is going to waste at the moment because we're not supporting our people in the way that we're not meeting them where they are. We're not supporting them for who they are. So let's talk about some of those strengths. What are we losing by not doing this when we talk about the strengths of introverts? What are introverts great at? How can we lean into the things that introverts might thrive doing?
So introverts are great listeners. You'll notice that or maybe not, but maybe after this conversation, look around in your workplace, and the quieter ones in the room will often wait for everyone to speak before they share their opinion. We listen to everyone's point of view, and we're often noticing things in the room that other people aren't noticing because they're very busy talking. An introvert thinks to speak, as opposed to an extrovert speaks to think. So we're great listeners and we're great observers, and we have a very acute attention to detail. We're very happy to work independently, very self-sufficient. We do like to work in teams, but as I said before, we like to have that space to retreat and recharge. And I like to call us really low maintenance people. I'm quite proud of the fact that I'm a low maintenance person. We're deep thinkers, so we're great problem solvers. And we can concentrate for very long periods of time without getting distracted. We're great. We're very creative people. We're very detailed people. We tend to over deliver. That's one of the ways that we prove ourselves. I guess it's in response to this bias that we feel, this judgment that we feel. Over delivering is good in one sense, but not great in another. So that can also be a bit of a weakness. And we've got an abundance of empathy, which is a really great asset, particularly in a leadership role.
Fantastic. I'm glad you brought up that point about leadership, because I've got a couple of things I want to ask about specifically in terms of where introverts can thrive in the workplace. And one of them was, can introverts really be great leaders when a big part of leadership is about setting vision and purpose, which means speaking a lot, speaking to many? And I would love to expand that out to when we were talking earlier about your background, having been an introvert working in a sales environment. Can introverts be good in environments like sales where it's a bit more aggressive? It's harder, like as in hard is the wrong word. It's the nature of the work that's being done is a bit more cutthroat. Maybe can introverts really thrive in those kinds of places, or is it that they kind of appear to clump into certain clusters of jobs that are better suited to introversion?
So personally, I don't think that there are introvert and extrovert jobs, and I don't think that helps remove the bias that exists. You're right, I had a 20-year career in sales and I was really good at it, and I'm absolutely convinced that's because of my personality traits. I don't talk a lot, but I listen a lot. And I will always find a way, I would always have found a way of connecting with a client on a human level. There's always an emotional reason why people will buy, and people buy from people, as we know, and an introvert will find that. People want to be listened to, they don't want to be sold to. So in that one-to-one situation, when you're listening to your client and you're understanding what it is about them and their situation, and you're creating that connection with them, they're feeling listened to, you're creating a deep connection, and they're not feeling like they're being talked at or they're being sold to. And as an introvert, when you've absorbed all of that information, you're much likely to gain the respect and the trust of that client. And then if you can follow through and deliver on that, then you've built a really strong rapport with that person. And it worked for me. I had a very different style compared to my colleagues. I wasn't all gung-ho, let's go in there, let's close the deal. Very good at nurturing relationships, very good at building them and connecting with people. and earning that trust and that respect. And that was a very, very solid foundation for me to build my sales career on.
That's a really great story to hear, because I think sales is the one area where it's an easy jump to kind of go, introverts couldn't possibly have them in a sales role. So I guess let's expand that out to tech, because a lot of folks on this call are obviously, we're here for the Tech Talent Charter, and they'll be thinking about their tech role holders. Is tech a destination that's friendly for introverts, that offers them things that potentially are beneficial environments? What do you think about the tech industry as a destination for introverted folks with tech talent?
I think it's perfect. I think it's absolutely perfect. If you think about how complex the tech is as a field, it's about creativity, it's about detail, it's about innovation, it's about it's about all of those things. And introverts are a great fit. Very detailed people, very good complex problem solvers, very creative people. I think it's an ideal fit for introverts and extroverts.
Great. I thought you would say that, but I wanted to ask. So let's talk about, from your point of view as a coach, what do folks need to understand about how they support introversion accessibility in the workforce? So give us some examples of what can we take away from this call that we can start doing.
Okay, I mean, we've talked about flexible work arrangements such as remote working and hybrid working. This is great for an introvert. Give them the space, give them the opportunity to work in that solitude, because that's where introverts do their best work, when they're given the quiet space and they're uninterrupted. That's when they're most creative and they're most productive. So give them that opportunity. Within the office environment, maybe have some designated quiet zones for people who can just go there. They can know they can be in the office, but if they have to be in the office, there's a quiet zone where they can go, and they know that they can do their deep work in that space. Introvert friendly meetings, make meetings more effective and more inclusive by just make sure that you issue the agenda beforehand, because as an introvert, what you like to do is you like to gather all your information, process that information, and organize your thoughts before you speak. So if you've given the agenda beforehand, an introvert can prepare, make a list of their bullet points, organize their thoughts, and they're more ready to contribute more quickly in that meeting environment. Just simple things like changing your language. So I've been in lots of meetings where people have said, let's hear it from the quiet people. Who hasn't spoken yet? Now, that's not the way to engage an introvert, because as an introvert, you're going to shrink and you're not going to be encouraged to speak. But if I were to say to you, Lexie, I always value your opinion. I'd really like to know what you think about this topic. That's a very different way of engaging somebody in a meeting and encouraging them, bringing them into it, rather than kind of spotlighting them. Introverts love to write as opposed to speak, generally speaking. So if possible, set up some structured written communication channels where introverts can really offer their thoughts and their contributions in written form as opposed to verbal form, and offer mentoring, offer coaching, offer support to those introverts who are ambitious, who do want to progress their careers. Offer them that support and that peer-to-peer network within the organization that's going to help elevate them and help them through their career journey.
Mm-hmm. That's really, really helpful for this kind of broader lens of if you're responsible for a team, how can you show some of that more inclusive leadership behavior, that inclusive language? If you're a line manager of someone, how do you find out if they're an introvert?
Yeah, I don't think you would ask them, are you an introvert? I think just noticing people, just notice Are they the first to speak up in meetings, or do they hang back? Are they more likely to join you for after office drinks, or are they more likely to want to go home? Do they have their lunch somewhere quiet, or do they engage in some of the more social aspects? Do you find that they write really well, but actually verbally they tend to get their words a little bit muddled? Because that can be quite common. As I said, we have taken the information, we process it, we organize our thoughts, and then we speak, and there often isn't that time for that. So we can get our words a little bit muddled, and what we actually think we want to say doesn't come out that way. So just look out for those people who tend to communicate written in a better way than they can verbally, who are maybe a little bit more stepped back from the group. They're not the first people to speak up in meetings. Those are the signs that maybe someone's an introvert.
Mm-hmm. And so you've got this idea, you think you might have some people in your team who are potentially introverts that you need to do more to support, or to adjust yourself, your behaviours a bit more to include. I would love to ask this question though about men and women as introverts.
Yeah.
Are they different, or does everyone kind of manifest introversion? The kind of the tells of introversion, do they manifest in the same way, or do we have to think about men and women differently when we think about introversion?
Personally, I don't think we do have to think about them differently. I think it manifests the same. I think perhaps the one difference is that potentially men may have more of a bravado about them. They may tend to mimic the extrovert a little bit more than women do. I mean, it is a common thing for introverts to mimic extrovert behavior. We do that because we think that's more accepted. But that's just a fast road to burnout, to be honest, because it's not sustainable. So if anything, I think perhaps maybe they're more inclined to do that, but actually I think it manifests just the same. And I've looked for research on this, and there isn't any source of reliable research that suggests otherwise.
Mm-hmm. That's really useful, because again, there are going to be a lot of people who are going to be focusing on this from a gender point of view, but it's this argument that if you get this right, you're getting it right for everyone, and that's a massive benefit. And it's particularly lovely to talk about that in November, because November is the month of Movember, of International Men's Day. So this is a really nice reminder for us to think about the fact that we've got to include everyone in these adjustments that we need to make to our workplace cultures. And actually, there's a fantastic article that came out. It was reported by Fast Company today that 60% of the workforce feel that they are covering themselves up at work. They are changing their natural default way of behaving better to fit in, and that's true of white men as it is for any other type of underrepresented group. So it's a great reminder for us to think about, if we can reframe how we think about inclusion, maybe it will give us some better angles for tackling this wider inclusivity effort that we've got going on. So I would love, because we're coming close to our time now, I would love to ask you, Lesley, final tips and final bits of wisdom that we need to take away from this call. What do we need to know? Advice and your view of the situation.
Okay, so first and foremost, understand the true meaning of introversion. Don't make any assumptions about those people. If you are an introvert, don't own the labels that people have put on you. If you're not shy, if you're not lacking in confidence, don't let other people tell you are, because the more we tell ourselves something, the more we believe it, and the more we adapt our behavior to suit. So then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, constantly being told you're shy or you're weird, you're, the office oddball, is going to convince you that you are the office oddball. So don't adopt the persona that other people give you. Secondly, embrace your introversion. Discover where your introvert traits really are and where they're strong, and own them. And this is your makeup, this is your natural state. And when you're completely aligned to your natural state, you can thrive anywhere. Reframe those traits from negatives into positives. For example, perhaps you might not be a great networker because you don't like small talk or having random conversations with strangers. Perhaps that doesn't interest you. But on a one-to-one basis, you know, you're very interested in having deep conversations and connecting with people. So be a strategic networker. Identify people who you want to have in your network and purposely make connections with them on a one-to-one basis. And tips for helping introverts to thrive is, like I said, consider your communication style. So if an introvert has as much information as possible in advance of your meeting, give them that information, and you'll have a much more productive meeting. We do generally have a preference over the written word as opposed to the spoken word, so wherever possible, give them the opportunity to contribute in written form. Introverts will often shrink when confronted with a group, so if you can tactfully bring them into a group by introducing them through their value contribution, that's one way to help that introvert overcome that barrier of getting into a group. And just create a safe space where people can come together. I know the word psychological safety is quite a buzzword at the moment, but make that space really safe for that introvert so that they can feel they can show up as they are, that there isn't the pressure on them to always be talking, always be contributing, and that it's okay actually if they sit in a meeting, go away, gather their thoughts and send you their contribution afterwards. Just try and make a few little adjustments.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Lesley, for taking the time to talk us through all of these things that you've seen and learned. Thank you so much. We'll put some links in the chat there to some resources we've got on psychological safety. And we've got a fantastic blog that Lesley has written for us, summarising some of these points and some of her experiences. So we'll also share that as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We'd love to invite you to share any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll answer those now. Cool. Okay. Well, if any.
So it's Angela. I did pop a quick question in the chat. I actually don't know if it came through. It's just about role modeling. So role modeling is often seen as a really good solution to help break biases and sort of show that people can really progress in their careers. But with introversion, many individuals, though not all, this is a bit of a broad statement, might be hesitant to be showcased as a role model, or might be sort of less willing to put themselves so broadly out there. And I wondered if you sort of have maybe a bit of discussion or any advice around, as a workplace, how can we achieve the goals of role modeling? For example, a senior female leader who is an introvert, but maybe that individual doesn't want to be role modeled. That individual isn't comfortable putting themselves out there quite so openly. I'd love to get your perspective around that.
Yeah, so I as you were talking there, I was kind of visualizing what you were saying as this, you know, senior woman who's really great at what she does and being really visible. And one of the things that introverts tend to shy away from is that visibility. But I think you can still be a role model and do that in a more discreet way. I think offering yourself as a mentor to junior or employees that are less senior than you are is still offering yourself out there as a role model, but in a more discreet way. So one-to-one mentoring is a really great way to showcase your strengths and to pass on your wisdom and guide people in their careers, and is generally generally leans more to the introversion traits, because that's a one-on-one interaction as opposed to a all singing, all dancing, look at me in front of an audience approach that definitely wouldn't suit an introvert. So I hope that answers your question. Oh, got a little heart from Andrew. Thank you, Andrew.
Awesome. And I can see we've got another question in the chat here. What practices can introverts adopt to maintain mental health and well-being in high pressure environments?
Okay, lots of them, probably more than we've got time for, but look, I'm going to go back to my corporate days here when I was running teams, and I used to find my days absolutely solid back to back, running from call to call, putting out fires, meetings, and it's exhausting. It really is. And you go home and you're burnt out. Own your diary. Just take control of your diary and figure out when you do your best work. When are you most energized during the day? And use that time to interact with people. Use that time to have the more powerful conversations that you need to have, and to be more customer facing, if you like. And then know what your limits are. So it might be 2 hours at 11 o'clock for 2 hours, that's where your energy is. So use that time wisely. Pre-charge before that, okay? Have 30 minutes of solitude before that, or an hour of solitude where you're working silently and you're charging up your energy. Go out there, do what you need to do, and then make sure that you have some recharge time after that. And that might just be 10 minutes, that might be 15 minutes, that might be 30 minutes. It depends what you need. But just make sure that you're not running from one thing to the next all day long, and that you've got little micro breaks in between what you're doing. Because if you do just power on through, you will be exhausted. And so yeah, it's absolutely essential that you own your diary and you plan that in. And I would go into my diary and physically block out sessions so that people couldn't put things in there, and that I had that time, that 15-minute break, just to get myself together and gather my energy, so that I was working effectively and I was protecting myself. Hope that's useful.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lesley. I can tell that that's an area that you've had a lot of personal experience with. So yeah. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer our questions, to talk to us about what you're doing. We'll make sure that we share Lesley's details as well when we push this out on our channel, so that folks can watch it at another time if needed as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and have a lovely rest of your day.